Cold air sits low along a Newark sidewalk in January of 1973, and your breath makes a small, steady cloud. You can picture the quiet of mid-morning, the muffled sound of traffic, and a few shop doors opening and closing. Helen Payne leaves home for an ordinary errand, the kind that rarely earns a note in anyone's day planner. The neighborhood is familiar, mapped by routine turns and short distances you don't usually think twice about. But when the expected time passes, the worry arrives in practical steps. A phone call here, a check with a neighbor there. Soon, you're looking at the first missing person report and the first careful questions that try to hold a timeline in place. Where was she last seen? What route would she have taken? And which small detail might matter later? In the early hours, officers do what they can with what they have, writing down names, times, and imperfect memories. And then, as days stretch forward, you begin to feel how a case can settle into paper, waiting for the patience that finally brings it back to the light. If you sit with that first report for a moment, you can almost hear the sound of a typewriter in the background. The form is plain, the boxes are small, and the story has to fit inside them. Name, age, address, clothing, last known location. The first concrete escalation comes when someone realizes this isn't a late errand anymore. It's late enough that you start checking places that aren't part of the routine. Hospitals get called. Local precinct desks get asked to scan their logs, and a patrol car gets sent, slowly, down streets that would normally be passed without a thought. Helen is described in the way families describe someone they expect to see again soon. They mention her habits, her timing, the small errands that made up a normal week. Someone points to the likely route she would have taken, a short walk or a familiar bus ride. Another person says she'd never stay away without calling. And that sentence, never without calling, becomes a quiet hinge in the case, because it tells you the absence is not like her. The first responders begin with what the early 1970s could offer. They canvass nearby blocks. They ask shopkeepers who are sweeping sidewalks and arranging items in windows. They check payphones, the kind that were used like public doorways into other people's lives. And they write down every name that offers a memory, even if the memory is unsure. Because an unsure memory is still something. Soon there's a small map on a desk. It's not a neat printed map. It's a practical sketch, the kind a detective draws while someone talks. A corner store, a bus stop, a street where the lights are a little dimmer in daytime. And next to the sketch, a timeline begins. Left home at this time, expected back by that time. Reported missing after a careful wait, not immediately because families often try to solve it themselves first. And then the timeline hits its first blank space. You can feel that blank space as a kind of quiet pressure. It's not dramatic. It's just the place where the ordinary ends. When a case is new, detectives often lean on the simplest explanation. Maybe she got delayed, maybe she stopped to talk, maybe there was a misunderstanding. So the first task is to confirm the basics, and confirm them gently. Where was she headed exactly? Who knew? What did she take with her? And what did she leave behind? In the earliest hours, you watch officers treat every small detail as something that could become important later. A description of her coat, the shoes she wore, practical for winter sidewalks. Whether she carried a handbag, and what might have been inside, keys, money, perhaps a small list. One neighbor says they saw her heading in the usual direction. Another neighbor isn't sure. A shopkeeper thinks they remember her face, but can't attach it to a time. And already you can see how memory starts to soften at the edges. The next development is a decision that often arrives quickly in missing person work. Expand the search radius. The assumption changes from she's nearby and delayed to we can't be certain. So they check transit routes. They ask about buses, the stops nearest her home. They call the terminal to see if anyone matching her description was noticed. They ask cab companies too, because a short ride can undo a whole timeline, and each call adds one more page to the file. In Newark, a working city with working rhythms, the streets don't stop for a missing person report. Trucks still back into loading bays. People still line up at counters. And the case has to move through that ordinary movement, trying to catch the one moment that went wrong. Detectives begin speaking to family again, not to repeat questions, but to refine them. Did she mention anyone troubling her recently? Did she seem distracted? Was there any reason she'd take a different street? Even once? The file begins to separate into two halves. The first half is what's known, the second half is what's possible. And you can feel investigators trying not to let possibilities become assumptions. One of the earliest investigative tools is simply presence. Uniformed officers walking blocks, asking quietly, looking into doorways and alleyways without making a spectacle. They check parks and lots. They look for anything that suggests a sudden interruption, a dropped item, a bag left behind. Nothing obvious turns up. And that absence of evidence becomes its own kind of evidence. When there isn't a single clear scene, the work turns toward people. Who saw her? Who might have had a reason to approach her? Not in a dramatic way, but in a street-level way. A conversation at a corner. An offer of help with a package. A familiar face offering a ride. Those are the moments investigators try to reconstruct. And they do it with lists. Lists of associates. Lists of names pulled from earlier calls and earlier notes. Another development arrives when detectives learn that some sightings don't line up. One person says they saw Helen near a familiar corner at a time that makes sense. Another person places her farther away, in an area she wouldn't typically go. The conflict doesn't mean someone is lying. It often means someone is trying to be helpful, and the mind is reaching for certainty. So the detectives do something slow and methodical. They go back. They ask again. They bring a photograph, and they ask the witness to describe the weather, the coat, the direction of travel. They're trying to anchor the memory to something real. As you sit with those interviews, you notice the tone of them. There's no shouting, no interrogation room drama. Just small rooms, a notebook, and a detective asking someone to slow down. What did you see? What did you hear? How sure are you? And what makes you sure? And then, after the witness leaves, the detective writes a summary that will have to stand in for that conversation years later. In the background, the case begins to attract the kind of attention that comes from worry, not spectacle. Neighbors keep an eye on their windows. Someone makes another round of calls. Family members try to remember every comment Helen made in the week before she vanished. And in those attempts to remember, you can feel the human desire to pull meaning from ordinary days. But ordinary days often don't offer clear signals. A new practical step comes next. Detectives check records that can confirm whether Helen interacted with institutions. Did she cash a check? Did she pick up a prescription? Did she visit a bank counter? In 1973, this kind of verification is slower than it would be today. It means calls made during business hours. It means speaking to managers, then waiting while someone looks through paper logs. It means accepting that not everything is recorded in a way that can be searched quickly. Still, each check narrows the possibilities. As the days lengthen, the urgency shifts into routine, and routine is how real investigations survive. A detective is assigned, then another. Supervisors want updates. The family wants updates too, and the updates are often careful, limited, honest. We are looking, we are checking. We have no confirmed location after she left home. And that sentence, no confirmed location, becomes the core problem, because you can't search a place you can't name. So they focus on what they can name. They name her likely route. They name the time window. They name the places she was expected to visit, and then they try to fill in the spaces between those names. Who lived along that route? Who worked along that route? Which buildings had rear entrances? Which lots were open? Which businesses had staff who might remember a face from that morning? They return to those places more than once, because the second visit sometimes produces what the first didn't. The next development comes when detectives start to separate reliable witnesses from hopeful witnesses. A reliable witness is someone whose memory is tied to an action. I sold her something. I watched her board a bus. I spoke to her at the counter. A hopeful witness is someone who thinks, maybe, that was her. The case needs both, but it leans on the reliable. So they revisit specific stores. They ask for sales logs if any exist. They ask employees to remember what the morning looked like. Was there a rush? Was the street quiet? Were there any unusual vehicles parked nearby? And slowly you see the outline of a day. Not a full day, just a partial one sketched in pencil. A neighborhood waking up. A woman stepping out to do something small. The ordinary becoming, without warning, untrackable. At this stage, another decision point appears for investigators. Do they treat this primarily as an endangered missing person case, or do they begin to consider a wider set of possibilities? The language matters. The resources follow the language. So they begin to involve detectives with experience in long-term cases, not just immediate searches. You can feel the moment the file thickens. Pages stack. Photographs are added. A copy of a missing flyer is placed in the folder. Names are underlined. And a small set of people begin to appear more than once in the notes, not because they're guilty, but because they are nearby, or they had opportunity, or they lived close enough to be noticed. This is how early person of interest lists are formed. They're cautious and they're imperfect, but they are a place to start. Detectives begin to look at known associates and recent contacts. They ask whether anyone has been persistent around her, anyone asking questions, anyone showing up where they shouldn't. They also consider the broader environment. Newark in the early 70s is a place with busy corridors, strong neighborhood ties, and also plenty of anonymity. It's possible to be seen and not truly noticed. And it's possible to be remembered incorrectly because so many faces pass each other every day. Another concrete development arrives when a tip comes in, the kind that always sounds confident at first. Someone calls to say they saw Helen in a particular area, at a particular time. The caller gives a description, and it seems plausible, so detectives do what they always do with a tip. They write it down. They evaluate it. They decide whether it can be corroborated. They send someone to check. They look for other witnesses nearby. They ask whether any businesses in that area remember her. And then, after hours of work, the tip doesn't solidify. It becomes one more page, one more line in a growing list of maybes. The file continues to grow anyway, because a case doesn't pause just because a lead is weak. Investigators keep canvassing. They keep calling. They keep returning to the same corners, hoping someone will suddenly remember a detail with sharp edges, a specific car, a specific phrase, a direction of travel. But memory, especially among strangers, often doesn't sharpen with time. It softens. It becomes mixed with other days. And then comes a development that changes the texture of the investigation. Something is found, not a solution, but an indicator that the search must widen. A personal item is reported missing, or an absence is confirmed that suggests she didn't simply choose to disappear. Detectives now treat the case with a heavier seriousness. They begin coordinating with other units. They check whether similar reports exist. They ask other departments if any unidentified person has been located, though they do it carefully, without assumptions. And the family hears the shift in tone, even if nobody says it directly. At this point, you can imagine yourself as the person standing over the file late in the evening. The office is quieter, the fluorescent lights hum, a cup of coffee goes cold. You read the same witness statements again, looking for a detail you skimmed earlier. You notice how often the same intersections appear. You notice which statements were taken early and which were taken after days had passed. And you begin to understand how time itself is part of the evidence. Because the sooner a detail is written, the less it has been shaped by conversation and rumor. Another development comes when detectives start checking for patterns beyond the immediate neighborhood. They reach out to agencies that keep track of certain types of offenders. In the early 70s, information sharing is more limited than it will be decades later. There's no instant database search across jurisdictions. There are phone calls, formal requests, and the slow movement of information through office channels. Still, they try. They ask whether anyone nearby has a history that would make them worth speaking to. And they add those names to the list too, with notes about addresses and prior contacts. In this kind of work, a decision can feel small but carry weight for years. Do you spend the afternoon re-interviewing a witness who seemed unsure, hoping their memory will settle? Or do you follow a tip that might take you out of the city, away from the core area? The detective in charge chooses a balanced approach. One team returns to the neighborhood, another team follows the tip. And the file records this division with simple lines: who went where and what they found. Often what they find is nothing, but nothing carefully documented prevents the same ground from being covered in the same way later. As weeks pass, you begin to feel the case settling into an early shape, a timeline that starts clear and then dissolves. A map with circles drawn wider and wider, a list of names, some crossed out, some underlined, some followed by a question mark. The family keeps asking, and the police keep working, but the work changes. It becomes less about immediate search and more about preserving the investigation's integrity. Because when answers don't come fast, the only promise investigators can truly keep is that the file will remain usable. That means collecting and storing what might matter: photographs, property records, notes on vehicle descriptions, any detail that could be checked again later when new information appears. In 1973, this is a physical effort. Folders, envelopes, file cabinets, card indexes, evidence bags labeled in handwriting. The discipline of it is quiet. And it's easy for the public to overlook because it doesn't look like action. But this is what makes long investigations possible. Another development arrives when detectives begin looking at proximity and opportunity more carefully. They identify a small set of individuals who lived or worked near the likely route. They ask where these individuals were that morning. They check whether their stories can be confirmed. In the early 70s, alibi verification is more dependent on people, not data. A boss who remembers a shift, a coworker who recalls a lunch break, a neighbor who saw a car in the driveway. These are fragile confirmations, and detectives know it, so they record the sources of each claim, not just the claim itself. And still, the center stays empty. No confirmed sighting after she left home. No single witness who can say, "I saw her here, at this time," with certainty. The absence becomes a kind of fog, and the investigation moves inside it, step by step. You can picture detectives placing calls that end in polite apologies. "No, we didn't notice." "No, we don't remember." "No, we don't keep that record." And each no is written down, not as failure, but as an eliminated path. The next development is the hardest kind. It's the moment when the working theory, whatever it was in the first days, stops being comfortable. It's not a loud moment. It's a quiet one. In an office where someone reads a sentence twice, then sits back and decides the case has to be treated as long-term. That decision changes the questions. Instead of asking only where Helen might have gone, detectives begin asking what could have interrupted her and where that interruption could have happened without being noticed. They look again at the route. They look again at the time window. They look again at the people who could move through that area without drawing attention. A few of the early names on the list are looked at with more care now, not with anger, not with assumptions, just with the slow attention that comes from realizing there isn't a quick explanation waiting around the corner. They check addresses, they confirm who lived where, they verify who had access to a vehicle, who worked odd hours, who had reason to be out that morning. Some of those checks go nowhere. A person can be close to a route and still have nothing to do with the disappearance. But the checks get written down anyway, because later, someone will need to know what was already done. And in cases like this, good notes are a kind of kindness to the future. The family keeps living inside the ordinary days. Laundry, meals, phone calls that begin with hope and end with a careful, quiet voice. In the background, detectives keep building the file, which means they keep asking for photographs, for handwriting samples, for a list of dental work if it exists, for any identifiers that could matter if an unknown person is found elsewhere. In 1973, these are practical steps. Slow steps, necessary steps. You can imagine the way those identifiers get gathered. A family member brings in a picture from a drawer. Someone points out a small detail, a scar, a piece of jewelry she often wore, a style of coat she preferred. A detective writes it down in plain language, trying not to sound clinical, trying not to sound like they're preparing for the worst, but also trying to be prepared. Another development arrives in the form of community memory. Someone mentions, almost offhand, that they saw a car idling near a corner that morning. They can't describe the license plate. They don't remember the make for sure, but they remember the feeling of it. A car that didn't seem to belong to the usual rhythm of the block. That kind of detail is difficult. It's easy to overvalue. It's easy to dismiss. So detectives treat it as a question, not an answer. They return to that corner. They stand where the witness stood, and they look at sight lines. What could a person see from here? What could a person miss from here? If a car was parked in a certain spot, would it have been noticed by more than one person? Would anyone else have had reason to remember it? A delivery driver? A bus operator? A shop employee? They ask, they listen. They add a few more names to the canvas list. A case like this often develops a second timeline, running alongside the first. The first timeline is Helen's known movements. The second timeline is the investigation itself, when calls were made, when leads came in, when officers returned to a location. When you read an old file later, that second timeline matters, because it tells you what was possible to know at the time. It tells you which doors were knocked quickly and which doors weren't. As the file grows, you start to see the limits of the era. There are no home security cameras to request, no cell phone location to obtain, no digital payment trail. A bus ride is a bus ride, and unless a driver remembers a face, it leaves almost nothing behind. A short walk through winter streets leaves nothing behind at all, unless someone is watching closely, and most people aren't. So detectives do the things that leave records. They check whether her name appears on any official paperwork after the day she went missing. They ask about employment records. If she worked, they check whether any mail is returned. They note whether utility usage changes at the home, small indicators of a life interrupted. And they keep the tone steady with the family, because panic doesn't help anyone think clearly. The first big setback is not a single event. It's the accumulation of ordinary days with no progress. A week becomes two becomes a month, and the neighborhood stops expecting a knock at the door with good news. People still care. They just begin to accept that the answer may not be quick. When that acceptance arrives, a different kind of work begins. It's quieter, it's more administrative, but no less important. The case is reviewed by supervisors. Resources are allocated elsewhere, and the detective assigned to Helen's file now has to carry it alongside newer cases that demand immediate attention. This is how cases begin to cool, not because anyone stops caring, but because time forces choices. Even as that shift happens, tips still come in. They arrive by phone. They arrive through someone who knows someone. They arrive as a sentence offered in a hallway, a friend of a friend saying, "I heard something." Each tip gets its own small moment of hope. Then it gets the same careful processing, a note, a follow-up, a check for corroboration. Most of them don't hold, but the file keeps them because later, patterns can emerge from what once looked like noise. One particular kind of tip arrives late, and it's the kind that investigators learn to handle gently. Someone claims Helen was seen in another part of New Jersey, or even out of state, at a time that would mean she left Newark quickly. The idea of voluntary departure always exists in the background of missing person cases, but it has to be supported by evidence, not just possibility. So detectives ask simple questions. Did anyone speak to her? Did anyone see her do something specific? Did anyone see her with luggage, with a companion with a clear purpose? Usually, the answer is no. And so the case stays in its central question. Where did the trail end? If you place yourself in the investigation, then you can feel the temptation to build a story anyway. The mind wants a story. But good detectives resist that. They keep the story in pieces, and they keep looking for the one piece that clicks. There's another development that comes quietly through record keeping. The case file begins to be referenced with an identifying number, and that number will follow it for decades. Index cards get made, one for Helen, one for key witnesses, one for each person of interest. Each card has a few lines, a date, a phone number, an address that might not exist in the same way later. And those cards, small as they are, become a skeleton for future review. If you've ever handled old files, you know how they feel. Paper that has softened, ink that has faded slightly, a smell of storage, dust, and time. A sense that every page was once urgent, once new, once held in someone's hands with fresh hope. This file begins to take on that future weight, even while it's still being worked. Eventually, the active work slows to periodic review. A detective checks back with a witness. A new officer scans the summary. A supervisor asks if anything has changed, and the answer is often careful and brief. No confirmed new sightings. No confirmed financial activity. No location. No person who can be held to a timeline tightly enough to break the case open. When a case reaches this stage, preservation becomes the main action. Evidence, if any exists, is packaged and labeled. Photographs are secured. Reports are duplicated. If there were any items recovered that might hold trace information, they are kept, even if the testing available at the time can't do much with them. This is one of the quiet miracles of long investigations. Someone decides to keep something just in case the future becomes more capable. In the 1970s, forensic science is already useful, but it isn't what it will become. Fingerprints can be compared, but only if you have something to compare them to, and only through the systems available then. Biological evidence can be typed in limited ways, but not individualized the way later DNA will allow. So detectives make a habit of saving what they can, because they know the tools will change. They just don't know when. Years begin to pass. The family ages, neighbors move, stores close and reopen under different names. A street corner stays the same in shape, but not in feeling. Newark itself changes in small ways. Some streets busier, some quieter, some buildings taken down, some repaired. And the case sits, not forgotten, but waiting. A few tips come in out of sequence, and you can hear the difference in them. A caller references something from long ago, but can't place the date. A person says they didn't speak up earlier because they didn't want involvement, and now they feel guilty. Another caller offers a name, but the name is common, and the details are thin. Investigators log the calls anyway. They try to chase what can be chased, but time has made the chase slower. At some point, a new detective inherits the file. This is a normal handoff, but it's always delicate, because the new detective has to learn the case through paper. They have to trust the earlier work. While also questioning it, they have to find the living parts of the case, the parts that can still be acted on, and they have to do it while also carrying the demands of current work. When personnel changes, small gaps can form. A witness's phone number no longer works. An address leads to a building that's been renovated. A person of interest has moved, or died, or is incarcerated on an unrelated matter. A report refers to an attached document that isn't attached anymore. These are not dramatic failures. They are the normal wear of time, and they make the file feel heavier. So the detectives who keep the case alive do what they can. They create updated summaries. They retype older notes into clearer formats, when possible. They label everything again. They make sure that if the case is reopened fully one day, the next team won't have to guess what a smudged line means. This is what patience looks like in a police department. It's not glamorous. It's steady. In the decades that follow, cold case work becomes more formal. Departments begin to understand that unsolved cases need a system, not just individual memory. Evidence storage improves. Logging improves. And eventually, units are created that exist specifically to return to cases like Helen's. Cases where the first investigators did what they could, but time and tools weren't enough. When you imagine Helen Payne's file sitting in a cabinet, you can imagine the label, her name, a date of disappearance, a case number, and perhaps a handwritten note on the edge of a folder, a reminder about one specific lead that felt important, even if it never proved itself. That's often how cold cases survive, through small acts of attention. Every so often, someone takes the file down. Sometimes it's because a new tip comes in. Sometimes it's because an unidentified person is found elsewhere and someone checks missing persons lists again. Sometimes it's part of a scheduled review, a department deciding to look at older cases with fresh eyes. These reviews don't always change anything, but they prevent the case from becoming purely historical. In one of those reviews, someone notices how much of the early timeline rests on uncertain sightings. They see that the last confirmed point, the last solid anchor, might be earlier than everyone assumed. And when that happens, the map changes. The likely route narrows. The time window tightens, and a few early assumptions begin to look less sturdy. This is a subtle shift, but it matters. If the case was built on a sighting that can't be confirmed, then years of thinking may have drifted in the wrong direction. So the new review begins with humility. It says, let's go back to the beginning. Let's treat every claim as a claim, not a fact, until it can be supported. Let's see what remains when we remove the softest memories. The detectives doing this work are often people who weren't alive or weren't working when Helen vanished. They don't have the emotional memory of the first search. They have paper. They have evidence logs. They have the ability to request records more efficiently than before. And they have something else too, a modern understanding that biology, carefully saved, can speak across decades. So they begin recontacting family if family members are still living. These conversations are different from the first ones. There's a gentle honesty in them. We know it has been many years. We know you've answered these questions before. We're going to ask again, not because we doubt you, but because time sometimes reveals what grief hid. A small argument remembered, a name that seemed irrelevant then, a routine that was never written down. The family might bring out old documents, a calendar, a letter, an address book, a photograph with the back dated in pen. These are the kinds of artifacts that can help rebuild a life's ordinary structure, which is what you need in order to notice when something broke that structure. And the detectives listen, not rushing, letting the quiet details settle into place. They also do something the first investigators could not do easily. They verify old addresses through broader databases. They cross-reference property records. They look at old phone listings. They check employment histories where they can. They map routes with updated tools, seeing distance and travel time with more precision. They try to reconstruct what was possible in that time window, on foot, by bus, by car. As they do this, one investigative thread begins to stand out. It's not a new thread. It's an old one that didn't get fully developed at the time, perhaps because there were too many demands, too many cases, too few resources. A name appears more than once in the margins of old notes. An address sits close to a key location. A person was spoken to briefly, but not deeply. And now, with decades of perspective, that thin interview looks like an unfinished sentence. The cold case team, or the detectives assigned to review, make a careful choice. They decide to focus. Instead of reopening everything all at once, they pick one line in the file and follow it to the end. They locate the person if possible. They locate surviving associates. They locate records that show where that person lived, worked, traveled. They don't accuse, they verify. Sometimes this work reveals that the original investigators were right to move on. Sometimes it reveals that a door was only half opened, and sometimes it reveals something unexpected. That a person's story changed over time, or that the alibi that sounded solid in 1973 was never truly confirmed. At the same time, another technical question is asked: what physical evidence exists, and where is it now? This is the quiet pivot point for many long cases, because you can't test what you can't find, and you can't use what you can't document. So the team requests evidence logs. They pull property room records. They ask about old storage procedures. They compare inventory sheets against the files mentions. In a well-preserved case, this is straightforward. In a case that has lived through decades of policy changes and building moves, it can be complicated. Boxes get relocated, shelves get reorganized, labels degrade. A property number gets transcribed incorrectly in an old report. So the work becomes part detective work, part archiving. They search slowly, item by item, until they can answer a basic question. Do we still have anything that can be tested? When something is located, the handling is careful. Chain of custody matters now in a way it did not always matter then. It mattered ethically, of course, but the legal system has become more demanding, more precise. So they document everything. Who retrieved it, when it was sealed, where it was stored, whether it was ever opened, whether the packaging is intact. If you picture this moment, it's not dramatic. It's a detective at a counter, signing a log. It's an evidence technician lifting a box and checking a number twice. It's a quiet room where someone photographs the packaging before it's disturbed. And it's the sense that time has been sitting inside that box waiting for modern tools to catch up. Then comes the request to test, a lab submission form, a description of the item, a case number that is older than some of the people processing it. The lab receives it the way labs receive everything, with professional distance but also with the understanding that old cases carry families with them. And the testing begins, slowly in the lab's own time. While the lab works, detectives return to the human side again. They keep following that underdeveloped thread. They locate an old address and discover it's been renumbered. They speak to a clerk in a municipal office who helps them translate an old block description into a modern map. They request archived booking records, if any exist, for people who were interviewed originally. They find a name in a report, then find the name again in another case file, and they note the connection without jumping to conclusions. Weeks pass, sometimes months. This is one of the most important parts of cold case work, the waiting. The lab has a queue. The lab has standards. The lab has to be certain, because a mistake in an old case can harm everyone involved. So detectives wait, and in that waiting they continue building a cleaner picture of 1973. Not a story, a picture. When lab results begin to return, they don't always return as a clear answer. Sometimes it's a partial profile, sometimes it's inconclusive. Sometimes it confirms only that the item contains biological material, but not enough quality to move forward. Each of those outcomes is a development, not because it solves anything, but because it tells the investigators what the future steps can be. And in long cases, knowing the next step is its own kind of progress. On a good day, the lab says there is something workable, a profile that can be developed further, a set of markers that can be compared, a possibility that didn't exist in the 70s, or even in the 90s. The detectives receive that information with quiet seriousness, because they know what it means. The investigation has a new direction now, one that can be verified or falsified with science. The next decision is procedural, but it carries weight. Where can this profile be uploaded? Which databases are authorized? What legal approvals are needed? What policies apply, especially if investigative genetic genealogy is considered? This part is slow, and it should be slow, because the goal is not just to identify someone, but to do it in a way that stands up later, in court, and in conscience. So they document the profile. They confirm the lab's methods. They preserve the data. They may first compare against known offenders in law enforcement databases, depending on rules and availability. They wait again. And in that waiting, they continue their old-fashioned work. The interviews, the address checks, the record pulls. Because even if a database returns a name, the case still has to be built around facts. When a database search does not produce an immediate match, that is not the end. It's simply information. So the detectives treat that non-match like a signpost, not a stop sign. They ask the lab a careful follow-up question about whether the profile is full, partial, or somewhere in between. A full profile can move through databases with more certainty. A partial profile can still be useful, but it may need a different path. They also ask about mixture. Sometimes older evidence holds more than one person's biology, and the lab has to separate what can be separated. The answer that comes back is quiet and technical. There is usable information here, but it isn't a simple clean match to a known person. And now the investigation has a choice to make. Stay with conventional database comparisons only and accept the limits, or consider the slower, more administrative road of investigative genetic genealogy if it is allowed and properly authorized. This isn't a choice made in a single afternoon. It involves policy, legal review, and a clear explanation of why this case qualifies for that kind of work. So the detectives begin assembling what you could call a permission packet. They summarize the case history, the efforts already made, and the reasons the evidence matters now. They also prepare the chain of custody documentation, because any later defense will look closely at how the item was stored and handled. And they speak with prosecutors early, not to rush, but to make sure each step is accountable. While that process moves forward, the team keeps doing something that feels almost old-fashioned. They keep reading the statements again, but now with the lab's numbers in the back of their minds. A biological profile does not tell you what happened. It only tells you that someone, somewhere, left a trace. So the detectives ask a gentler but sharper question. If this DNA belongs to someone involved, where would that person have intersected with Helen's routine? You return to the map. Not a dramatic map with pins, just a working map with pencil marks and careful notes. You look at the likely errand route again. You look at the last confirmed point again. And you notice, as so many cold case teams do, that a case can be shaped by what sounded reasonable at the time. In 1973, a witness saying, "I saw her near that corner," might have carried the timeline forward by an hour. Now, the review asks whether that hour was earned, or whether it was simply hoped for. So they tighten the timeline to the last, truly verified moment. And in doing that, they make the problem smaller, and therefore more solvable. A smaller window means fewer passing cars. It means fewer people who could have been present without being noticed. And that narrowing becomes a quiet form of progress. Another practical step follows. They start collecting records about the neighborhood as it was then. Not just addresses, but the texture of the place. Which businesses were open on that block in 1973? Which buildings had back entrances? Which lots were vacant? What streets were one way at the time? These details sound small, but they help an investigator imagine movement honestly. Because movement is what the case is missing. A confirmed path. And sometimes, the path is hidden in geography, not in motive. They request old city directories. They search newspaper archives for business advertisements and for mention of construction, roadwork, or closures. They pull property records in bulk, the kind that show ownership and tenancy. Then they compare those records to the early list of persons of interest. This is slow work. It's also quiet work, the kind done at desks, with highlighters and careful attention. In a case like Helen Payne's, you can almost feel the difference between old and new methods. The old methods were mostly conversations and shoe leather and calls made from a station phone. The new methods are databases, archives, and the ability to connect dots that were always there, just too far apart. But still, it's the same human effort. Around this time, a detective makes an important decision about the case file itself. They create a clean master timeline, one that lists only what is confirmed and separates what is unconfirmed into a different section. They label each entry with its source, a family statement, a police report, a witness interview, a lab result. This may sound like paperwork, but it changes everything. Because it prevents the case from being driven by rumor. It also allows the team to see where assumptions piled up year after year, like dust. And when you clear that dust, you can see the surface again. With this new structure, they reevaluate the early witness statements, not to criticize the people who gave them, but to understand their reliability. They note which witnesses described clothing correctly, Which witnesses had a reason to know Helen? Which witnesses were simply trying to be helpful and might have been describing someone else? And they note something else too: how quickly each statement was taken. A statement taken the same day has a different feel from one taken weeks later. It's less polished, less shaped, often more truthful in its uncertainty. And uncertainty is not the enemy if it is recorded honestly. As this review continues, that underdeveloped thread from earlier becomes more defined. A name, an address, a vehicle connection, something that kept appearing at the edges. In the early file, the references were brief. A quick interview, a note that the person lived nearby, a line that the person was seen in the area. Nothing that was enough on its own. But now the team has tools to look deeper. They run the name through modern records. They check for date of birth. They check for past addresses. They look for employment history. They look for any connection to other investigations, not to assume guilt, but to understand patterns. They also check whether the person is still alive, because after decades, that question matters. It changes what justice can look like, and it changes how quickly the team must move if there is still a living suspect. If the person is deceased, the work becomes about confirmation and truth. If the person is alive, the work becomes about building a case that can stand without shortcuts. Either way, the goal remains the same: to be accurate. At this stage, there is often a moment when the investigation turns from wide to narrow, not because the detectives want it to, but because evidence begins to point. They may not have a name yet, but they have a sense of direction. They have a short list that feels more realistic than the long lists of the 1970s. And they have a new kind of clock ticking, not urgency for excitement, but urgency for completeness. Because every year that passes removes another witness, another memory, another chance to verify something with a living voice. So they move steadily. While legal approvals for genealogy work are considered, the detectives also explore another route. They ask whether any items associated with Helen were collected and stored, beyond what they already tested. Sometimes, an old evidence submission focused on one item, while another item sat in a box, untested, for decades. So, they check the property room again. They compare the evidence inventory to the narrative reports. They look for lines like, collected for safekeeping, or retained pending further examination. Those phrases can hide the most valuable things. An evidence technician helps them open old packaging carefully. They photograph each seal. They document each transfer. They do it slowly enough that it feels almost ceremonial, because in a case like this, evidence is not just an object, it's a preserved moment. And as they work, the lab provides another update. The profile they developed can be formatted for a genealogy-style search, using the appropriate lab and the appropriate standards. That doesn't mean it will work. It means it can be tried. The team consults with specialists, people who do this kind of work every day, building family trees from distant genetic matches. It's a strange kind of investigation when you think about it. Not knocking on doors, but tracing connections through shared ancestors. It requires patience of a different kind. The patience to accept that the first result may be a third cousin, once removed, living across the country. Still, it is a path, and the case has been waiting for paths. When permission is granted, the profile is uploaded in the proper way to the proper system. Not a public internet search, but a regulated process with documentation. Then comes another stretch of waiting, days, weeks, sometimes longer. The detectives keep working on parallel tracks. They revisit the neighborhood records. They confirm which bus lines ran then and where stops were placed. They check whether any old transportation logs exist, even if it is unlikely. They also go back to family again, because family often holds one more detail that was never asked. A neighbor's name, a repairman who came by. A regular stop Helen made that she didn't even consider worth mentioning. These are soft details. But cases are sometimes solved by soft details, held gently and then connected. And then, in the genealogy work, the first meaningful result appears. Not a direct name, a cluster, a group of matches that share enough DNA to suggest a common line. The specialist begins building a family tree backwards and sideways through records, census data, birth and marriage certificates, obituaries, old newspaper notices, all of it building a web that leads, slowly, toward a person who could have been in Newark in 1973. This is where the work becomes both scientific and deeply human. You are looking at families, at migrations, at names changing with marriage, at people moving for work. You are seeing the way lives intersect without anyone realizing. And you are doing it in service of one missing woman and one unanswered day. The genealogy specialist provides a list of possible candidates. It isn't long, maybe a handful. Men of a certain age range, connected to the family lines that fit the DNA. The detectives don't treat the list like a list of suspects. They treat it like a list of questions. Who among these people was in New Jersey then? Who lived near Newark? Who had an address that appears in the old file? Who had a vehicle? Who had any connection, even indirect, to Helen's neighborhood? This is where records work becomes the heartbeat. They start with residency, old motor vehicle records, if available, old voter registrations, city directories again. They look for a candidate who shows up in the right place at the right time. Not proof, just alignment. And one name begins to align more than the others. Not because the person is famous, not because the person was on anyone's radar, but because the paper trail places him close. An address within a reasonable distance of Helen's likely route. Employment that would have put him on the streets at the relevant hours. A life that intersected quietly with her world. And when detectives see that alignment, they slow down even more. Because this is the stage where mistakes are tempting. It is easy to fall in love with a theory, but the work requires discipline. They look for reasons the person could not be involved. They check for incarceration records, hospitalization, military service, anything that would remove him from Newark at that time. They look hard, and when they cannot remove him, the next step becomes necessary. They need a confirmatory DNA sample. Genealogy points you toward a person, but it does not finish the job, so investigators plan carefully. If the person is alive, they consider discrete collection methods that are lawful, a discarded item collected under proper rules, or a court order if necessary. If the person is deceased, they consider other options, a preserved personal item, a stored medical sample if it exists and can be obtained legally, or a close relative who will consent to comparison, again within legal bounds. Each option carries ethical weight, and in a calm investigation, ethics are not a sidebar. They are the foundation. So the team meets again with prosecutors and with supervisors, and they document the plan. At the same time, they return to the old case file and look for this name, not to force it in, just to see if it was there, quietly all along. Sometimes a name appears once, on a canvas sheet. Sometimes it appears on a list of residents. Sometimes it appears nowhere. In Helen Payne's case, the name, or a related address, had brushed the file before. Not strongly enough to hold attention then, but enough that, now, it feels like a whisper from the past. A reminder that many investigations are limited, not by care, but by the tools and time available. The detectives begin doing what you might call lifestyle reconstruction. They examine where this person lived, where he worked, and what his daily routes might have been. They look for overlap with Helen's probable movements. Overlap is not guilt, but overlap is opportunity, and opportunity matters. They also look for any prior police contact that might have put him on lists in the 70s. Again, not as character judgment, just as a practical matter of whether his name could have been known to officers then. Now comes one of the gentlest but most difficult tasks: re-interviewing people who knew him. After decades, these conversations are delicate. You are asking someone to remember an ordinary winter nearly half a lifetime ago. So detectives do not begin with accusations. They begin with context. Where did you live then? What do you remember about that street? What kind of work did he do? Did he keep unusual hours? Did he talk about the neighborhood? Did he mention Helen or any missing person news at the time? Often the answers are simple. I don't remember. That was so long ago. He was just working, living, doing what people do. But sometimes a person remembers one small thing. A car that was changed. A move that happened suddenly. A period of anxiety. A habit of driving certain streets. Nothing cinematic. Just human detail. And detectives collect it and label it properly and treat it carefully. Then the confirmatory DNA effort begins. It might be a simple process if the person is accessible. It might be longer, requiring warrants and careful surveillance. In any case, the goal is a clean comparison performed by a lab with clear documentation, because this is where the investigation leaves the realm of possibility and enters the realm of proof. When the sample is obtained, it is sent for comparison. And again, there is waiting. The waiting in this stage feels different. Not anxious, if you do it right. More like standing still so you do not disturb what is delicate. The detectives continue working, but they also prepare. They begin drafting a full case narrative as it stands now. They outline what the original investigation did, what the cold case review did, and how the DNA work connected to the name. This narrative will matter for prosecutors, and for the family, and for the historical record. And it will matter for the detectives themselves, because it forces clarity. If you cannot explain a case clearly, you do not yet understand it well enough. So they explain it to each other, line by line. At last, the lab result arrives. It confirms that the person identified through the genealogy work is the source of the DNA profile. This is not, on its own, the whole case. But it is a powerful anchor. After 47 years, the investigation has a name that can be defended with science. And now the work shifts again back to the human world, where motives and movements must be placed beside that scientific fact. The detectives take the next step slowly. They verify everything they can about the identified person's life in 1973. Addresses are checked against city records. Employment is checked against payroll stubs if they exist, or union records, or tax documents. Vehicle ownership is traced through motor vehicle files. They look for any record of a vehicle matching the old, uncertain car tip. Sometimes, those old vehicle descriptions are too vague. But sometimes, the make and color line up in a way that makes you sit quietly for a moment. When a make and a color line up, you don't celebrate. You just make a note, and you make it neatly. Because old descriptions can be borrowed from other days, and other cars, and other winters. So the detectives do what patient work always asks for. They look for a second source. They check whether the identified man ever registered a vehicle change around that period. They check whether insurance records can be located, or whether a carrier still exists. Often those trails are gone. But sometimes there's a surviving paper in a county archive, or a microfilm roll nobody touches anymore. They also look for parking tickets, minor municipal records, anything that proves a car was in a place. It's not glamorous evidence. It's the kind of evidence that tells you a person moved through the city like everyone else. And if you can place the car, you can begin placing the day. The identified man's address history matters here too. An address is not proof, but it is geography. If he lived close enough to Helen's likely route, then his presence on those streets wouldn't have stood out. He could have been another face at a corner, another person waiting for a light. So the detectives build a map that is quieter than the movies. Home address in 1973. Work address, if they can confirm it. Any secondary address, a relative's place, a girlfriend's apartment, a rooming house. They mark bus lines too, because not everyone drove every day. They mark places people gathered, diners, corner stores, a bar that's now a different business. And then they lay Helen's route on top of it, as gently as you'd lay a thin sheet of tracing paper. The overlap is what they sit with, not as a conclusion, but as a question that can be tested. Was he likely to be on that block on that morning? Could his daily routine have put him near her without anyone thinking twice? If the answer is yes, the next question becomes harder. How do you connect a scientific identification to a historical act? You don't do it with drama. You do it with documents. You do it with old statements, reread with new eyes. So they return to the earliest interview notes and they look for mentions of unfamiliar men in the area. They look for anyone who reported being approached, not by Helen but near where she vanished. They look for the kinds of details people offered and then forgot they offered. A man who seemed to be watching. A car that lingered. A stranger asking directions in a way that didn't feel natural. And they don't force it. They just line it up and see what holds its shape. Some of those early notes are disappointingly thin. A detective wrote fast and didn't record the full description, or they wrote, "Witness unsure," and moved on. But other notes are surprisingly careful. A witness described a height, a coat, a posture, a way of speaking, maybe an accent. And now the detectives can compare those descriptions gently to what they know about the identified man. Height, from a driver's license record. Age, in 1973. Photographs from later arrests or work documents, if any exist. They don't pretend it's perfect. It's not. But it's one more layer. One more careful attempt to see whether the file is pointing consistently or just echoing. At this point, the investigation becomes a series of quiet meetings. Detectives and supervisors in an office with the door closed. A prosecutor invited in early because decisions made now will shape everything later. The question is straightforward even if the work behind it is not. Do we have enough to proceed? And if so, how? In a case this old, you don't just consider evidence. You consider what can be presented in court and what can be explained to a jury with honesty. You consider chain of custody. You consider whether witnesses are still alive. You consider whether there are recordings or only summaries. And you consider the identified man's current status, living or deceased. Because the path is different depending on that single fact. The team confirms it carefully through official records. A death certificate if applicable, or a current address and contact information if not. They do not rely on hearsay. They rely on the paper that the court will accept. If he is alive, the next step can be an interview, not an ambush. A planned conversation with a clear legal strategy. If he is deceased, the next step becomes building a posthumous case file, one that can still answer the family's questions. Either way, detectives continue doing the slow work of verification. They request any available prior police reports involving him, even minor ones, not to pile on, not to paint a picture of a person's soul, just to understand his movements, his addresses, his associates. They look for any connection to Helen's family, even indirect. A mechanic used by both households. A landlord who rented to multiple people on the same block. Sometimes the connection is nothing, and nothing recorded well is still useful, because it prevents you from inventing a link later. And invention is the enemy of truth. One of the more delicate parts of this stage is reapproaching the family. After decades, they have lived with uncertainty as part of the furniture of their lives. You don't want to shake that furniture without reason. So the detectives schedule a meeting in a calm place at a time that works for them. They explain what has changed. Not everything, not all at once. They explain that DNA preserved through careful storage has provided a name. They explain what that does and does not mean. It does not answer every question. It does not bring back the missing years, but it changes the case from an open fog into a file with a specific direction. And for family, that can feel like relief and pain at the same time. You can imagine the quiet in that room. A photograph on the table, maybe the same photograph used on old flyers. A detective speaking slowly. with simple words. We have a person. We are working to confirm the timeline. We will not promise what we cannot deliver, but we will keep you informed. And the family, if they can, might offer one more small detail. A memory about a car that used to park near their house. A name they heard in the neighborhood back then. A moment when Helen mentioned being uncomfortable but didn't want to make a fuss. These details arrive late, not because the family hid them, but because grief rearranges memory. And only when a name appears does the mind know where to hang the memory. It's not magic. It's how people work. After that meeting, the detectives return to the file and add what they learned. They don't treat it as evidence in the strict sense, not yet. They treat it as a lead to be corroborated. They check whether the name the family mentioned appears anywhere else. They search old address books, old city directories. They run the name through databases. And if they find a connection, even a small one, it becomes another thread in the tightening weave. At some point, the investigation needs a single, clean narrative, not a story that fills gaps with imagination, but a sequence of verified steps and reasonable inferences. The prosecutor will ask for that. The court will demand that, and the family deserves it. So detectives begin building what is often called a case summary, but this one has a special weight. It has two timelines inside it. The 1973 timeline of Helen's day, as best as it can be confirmed, and the modern timeline of the cold casework, showing how evidence was found, tested, and compared. They write it in plain language, they attach copies of the lab reports, they attach chain of custody logs, they attach maps, not as theatre but as orientation. And then they look for the weak points, because every case has them. One weak point is almost always witness memory. A witness interview from the 70s might not be admissible in the way a modern recorded interview is. Another weak point is the absence of a confirmed final location. Even with DNA, you still have to show relevance. You have to show how this person's biology ended up on an item connected to Helen, in a way that indicates involvement, not coincidence. So, the detectives focus on the context of the evidence itself. Where was the item found? When was it collected? Was it packaged properly? Was it stored securely? Was it ever handled in a way that could have introduced contamination? These questions are technical, but they are also moral. They're about being fair even to a person you suspect strongly. And being fair is part of being accurate. The lab is asked for additional clarification. Not just, is the match confirmed, but how strong is it in the language the court uses? They ask for likelihood ratios, for statistical framing that can be explained without exaggeration. They ask whether the profile is a single source profile or a mixture. They ask whether there were any signs of degradation and what that means. All of this becomes part of the case file, and the file begins to feel, at last, like it is moving toward a decision. In many cases, this is the stage where an interview with the identified person becomes central. If he is alive, detectives decide whether to approach directly or whether to first gather more corroboration. A direct approach can risk a denial and a lawyer, and then the conversation is over. A slower approach can build more context, but it takes time, and time is always the one thing you cannot store in a box. So they weigh it carefully. They check whether the person has any history of cooperating with police. They check whether he is currently involved in any other legal matters. They consider his age, his health, his likelihood of fleeing, his ties to the community, and finally they decide on a plan, one that is lawful and calm. They will speak to him. They will do it with clarity and with as little spectacle as possible. Sometimes these interviews happen in a home, sometimes at a station, sometimes in an attorney's office. The location matters less than the structure. They know what they can say, they know what they cannot say, they know what questions they must ask, and in what order. You can picture the detective reviewing notes in the car before walking up. Not to rehearse intimidation, but to steady the sequence. Name, date of birth, addresses in 1973. work history, whether he knew Helen, whether he spent time in her neighborhood, whether he owned a vehicle, and what kind. Simple questions first, because simple questions are where inconsistencies appear. When the conversation happens, if it happens, it is often quiet. The identified man may deny knowing her. He may say he doesn't remember that winter at all. He may say, "I lived there, but I didn't know everyone." And that might be true. Cities are like that. But denial isn't the end of an interview. It's the beginning of the careful part. Because then detectives can ask about specifics that can be checked. Where did you work? What hours did you keep? Which route did you take home? Did you ever shop at these stores? Did you ever park on this block? They listen for what is volunteered, not just what is answered. They listen for anger, for confusion, for the way someone reacts when they realize a case is not just a rumor anymore. And they do it without raising their voices, because volume doesn't create truth. If he asks what this is about, they may tell him carefully. We are investigating the disappearance of Helen Payne. We have new forensic information. We want to understand your connection to the area at that time. Depending on counsel and circumstance, the interview may end quickly. Or it may continue, with pauses, with long moments where someone thinks. Sometimes, in very old cases, a suspect will say something like, "I thought nobody would ever ask me about that again." It's a small sentence, but it carries weight, because it acknowledges the passage of time as a shield. Whether that sentence appears here depends on facts we do not fully control, and good narration doesn't pretend otherwise. What matters is what the detectives do next. They do not rely on the interview alone. They take what was said and they test it against records. If he claims he worked a day shift, they see if payroll exists. If he claims he didn't have a car, they check vehicle registration. If he claims he lived elsewhere, they verify addresses through property records. Each verification is a step toward a case that can stand even if the person never speaks again. At the same time, they may seek additional searches where legally justified. If there is probable cause and proper authorization, they may look for retained items, old photographs, journals, anything that could connect him to Helen. They may look for souvenirs, not because they expect them, but because the law allows searching for evidence that corroborates. And they handle that stage with the same quiet discipline as the lab work. Photograph, log, seal, chain of custody again, because chain of custody is the bridge between discovery and court. The case becomes, in this phase, a balance between science and narrative. Science gives you identity, narrative gives you meaning, and the law needs meaning. A jury needs to understand why DNA matters in this context, why it is not an accident. So detectives look for one more piece, not necessarily a confession. Sometimes the one more piece is a corroborating witness, a person who, after decades, remembers that man being in the area, or remembers Helen mentioning him even vaguely. Sometimes it's a document, a lease agreement that places him next door to a key location. Sometimes it's a pattern, a similar approach reported by another woman in the neighborhood around that time, documented in a separate file. And that's when cold case work can widen briefly, not to distract, but to confirm context. They search other reports from that winter and the months around it, not for sensational parallels, but for practical overlap. Was there a series of complaints about a certain car? Was there a man who offered rides, who approached women at bus stops? Even if those reports are minor, they can show opportunity and method. They can show that a thing happened more than once. If they find such reports, they document them carefully. They verify the addresses. They confirm whether the identified man lived nearby then or knew someone who did. They do not overstate the connection. They just place it in the file as context. As the case tightens, the detectives also prepare for another reality. Time affects prosecution. Statutes, evidentiary rules, and the availability of witnesses all matter. So the prosecutor reviews what charges are legally appropriate, if charges are possible at all. This is not a moral decision alone. It's a legal one, guided by what can be proven. And in older cases, even when identification is clear, the courtroom path can be complicated. The team keeps the family informed, but not overwhelmed. They explain gently that the law has to be followed. They explain that an arrest, if it comes, will not answer every question. They explain that court timelines can be slow, and the family often has already learned slow. They have been living in slow for decades. In the background, you can imagine the old file now sitting open on a modern desk, old pages next to new printouts. A lab report with modern fonts beside a yellowing witness statement typed on a manual machine. It's a strange pairing, but it's also a quiet triumph of preservation. Someone kept the right thing. Someone labeled it. Someone did not throw it away during a move, or a purge, or a reorganization. And because of that, the case is no longer drifting. It is moving steadily toward a point where the department must decide what to do with the name they now have. This is also the stage where media attention can reappear, even if the department doesn't seek it. A case that has been unsolved for decades has a way of resurfacing once a name is attached. But within the investigation, the tone remains quiet. Inside the department, that quiet tone means routines. It means the same detectives showing up, opening the same folder, and checking the same boxes twice. It means making sure the science and the paperwork agree, down to the date and the initials on each seal. One of the first decisions now is about timing. Do you move quickly toward an arrest while the trail is warm again? Or do you slow down and make the evidentiary story as complete as it can possibly be? In a case that old, the team usually chooses the second path, even when it's difficult. Because an arrest without a stable foundation can collapse later, and collapse hurts everyone. It hurts the family who has to reopen the wound. It hurts the integrity of the work, and it even risks harming the truth by letting an avoidable mistake take the place of careful certainty. So, the detectives do something that feels almost like housekeeping. They audit the file. They list every item of evidence, every report, every supplemental note, and every lab submission. They check which items were tested, which were not, and why. Sometimes in an old case, you find an evidence envelope that was logged but never examined with modern tools. Not because anyone ignored it, but because the technology wasn't there. Or because the lab queue was too long. Or because the case ran out of active momentum before the testing could be justified. In Helen Payne's case, the team looks for anything like that. A second item, a secondary swab, a small sealed package with handwriting from the 1970s. And when they find anything at all, they treat it as potentially important. They submit additional items if the chain of custody is clean. They ask the lab to confirm whether there's a chance of developing another profile, not to complicate the case, but to check for completeness. Because sometimes you learn there was more than one person involved, or more than one contact point. And sometimes the additional testing produces nothing useful. That happens often with older evidence, because time and storage can degrade what you hope to find. Still, a negative result is a result. It tells you where the evidence speaks and where it stays silent. At the same time, the detectives build what prosecutors often call the corroboration package. It's the part that answers the simple question, why this person and why now? Not in emotional terms, in plain document-backed terms. So they gather residency proof, they gather employment proof, they gather vehicle ownership proof, if it exists. They gather anything that places the man in Newark, in that specific winter window. You can picture the kinds of places they have to go for this. County clerk offices, where old property records still live in quiet cabinets. State archives, where microfilm sits in drawers that squeak open. Sometimes even union halls, where a clerk might help locate an old membership card. There's a particular patience required for that, because every institution has its own rules. Some records require formal requests. Some require fees. Some require waiting for a staff member who knows the older system. And every step is logged. because later you'll need to explain how you got what you got. If the identified man is alive, there is another decision running alongside all of this. Whether to seek an indictment early to preserve the ability to hold him, or whether to wait until every reasonable supporting piece is in place. That decision is made in conference rooms with legal pads and careful voices. The detectives also consider a quiet reality. Even with a name and a match, an old case can still contain uncertainty about the precise sequence of events. The law doesn't ask you to know every minute, but it does ask you to prove what matters beyond reasonable doubt with what you can demonstrate. So, the team focuses on what can be shown. The evidence exists. It was preserved, it was tested properly, it points to this individual. And that individual had a credible opportunity to intersect with Helen's day. Opportunity is built through small proofs, street by street geography, a home address that places him within walking distance or driving distance of her likely route, a work schedule that makes his presence plausible during the relevant hours, and, when possible, a past statement that shows he was in the area. If his name appears in an old canvas list even once, that matters, not as guilt, as a sign that he was part of the neighborhood fabric and therefore could have been near her without drawing attention. The detectives retrieve that old document and preserve it as an exhibit, with new context. They also look for any prior mention of him in Helen's life, not only in police files, but in the soft records people forget. Old address books, holiday card lists, a neighbor's memory that he lived in a building where Helen sometimes passed by. If the family has an old notebook, they examine it with permission and care. Sometimes they find nothing, and nothing is allowed to remain nothing. They do not force a connection just because they want one. They write, "No known personal relationship established as of this date." There's another practical step that happens now, and it can feel strangely intimate. The detectives gather photographs of the identified man from the period closest to 1973. This isn't about sensational comparisons. It's about checking whether old witness descriptions, however fragile, could plausibly match his appearance. They might locate a driver's license record photograph. They might locate an old employment badge photo. They might find a yearbook photo or a newspaper image or a booking photo from a later arrest if one exists. They handle these images quietly, and they store them carefully. Then, if there are surviving witnesses who described a man or a vehicle, detectives consider whether a photographic lineup is appropriate. This is delicate, because memory after decades is not reliable in the way courts would ideally like. So they consult with prosecutors. They consult with best practices. They ask, will this help, or will it add confusion? Often in old cases, the best use of witnesses is not identification, it's context. It's establishing routines, confirming geography, and documenting what the neighborhood looked like at the time. So the team may choose not to risk a late identification attempt. Instead, they build the story around what is strongest: forensics, documentation, corroborated history, and any statements, old or new, that can be verified independently. This is also where the case begins to touch other parts of the justice system. If the suspect is alive, they check his current supervision status, if any, probation, parole, prior convictions. Not to judge character, but because it affects how you contact him and what legal tools are available. If he's already incarcerated on an unrelated matter, the interview and collection procedures change. If he's living quietly, the approach is different. Either way, the plan is designed to be calm, controlled, and lawful. Now, a quiet reveal often appears at this stage, and it comes from a place people don't expect. Old paperwork sometimes contains an overlooked inconsistency, an address written two different ways, a reported work location that doesn't match a later record, a date that was assumed, but never actually confirmed. In Helen Payne's file, the team finds small contradictions like that. Not the kind that breaks the case, the kind that invites more careful review. So they pick one, they follow it, and they either fix it or they document that it cannot be fixed. For example, if the suspect claimed a certain job in that period, Detectives try to find proof. If the company is gone, they look for successor companies. They look for tax records. They look for union records. If none exist, they document the attempts. Because later, in court, an honest record of effort matters. Another development arrives through digital mapping. Not flashy mapping, just accurate mapping. Detectives measure walking time between Helen's likely route points. They consider bus schedules that existed then if they can be reconstructed. They calculate how far someone could drive in the relevant window given the streets and traffic patterns of that era. This is used for one thing, to keep the narrative honest, to prevent claims that require impossible travel, to keep the sequence grounded so that the case is built on what could happen, not what might sound plausible. And then, slowly, the department and the prosecutor's office start to converge on a decision. This case is old, but it is now evidence-driven. The DNA match is confirmatory. The chain of custody is documented. The suspect's presence in the area is supported. The story, while incomplete in places, is coherent enough to be presented. At that point, the decision becomes formal. Whether to seek charges, whether to present to a grand jury, whether to request an arrest warrant. Those steps vary depending on jurisdiction and circumstance, but the principle is the same. They do it in order, they do it on paper, they do it in a way that can be reviewed. And while those legal steps begin, the detectives return to the family again. They do not let the family learn from television if they can prevent it. They do not let the family hear a name second-hand. So a meeting is scheduled, a small room, a few chairs, sometimes a victim advocate present, someone trained to help the conversation land gently. The detectives explain where things stand now. They explain that they have a confirmed forensic link to an individual. They explain what next steps are likely. They explain what they cannot yet say. And they give the family time, because time is what has been taken from them already. This is also where you see how resolution is not a single feeling. It's a mixture. Relief that the unknown has a shape. Grief that the shape is real. Anger that the years are gone. And sometimes a numb quietness, because the mind can only absorb so much at once. The detectives answer questions carefully. Some questions can be answered, others cannot. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. But they do not pretend. They don't offer neat closure. They offer the truth as it exists, with its edges still uneven. Another practical consequence follows. Once an arrest warrant is sought, the department has to prepare for the moment the case becomes public. Even if they try to keep it quiet, court filings become accessible. Names become searchable. Reporters begin calling. And so the department prepares a factual statement. You can imagine the drafting process. A few sentences, revised again and again. No speculation, no unnecessary detail. Just the core facts. Helen Payne disappeared on the relevant date. The case remained open. New forensic testing and investigative work identified a suspect. An arrest has been made, or charges are being pursued. That's it. Inside the department, the detectives also prepare for defense scrutiny, because a good defense attorney will question everything. Why was evidence stored this way? How do you know it wasn't contaminated? Why did you focus on this suspect and not others? How reliable is genealogy? How reliable is an old witness statement? And the detectives answer those questions before they are asked, by building the file correctly. They include lab protocols, they include chain of custody logs, they include policy compliance documentation for the genealogy process, they include notes explaining why certain leads were pursued and why others were closed. This is where patient work pays off, not because it makes a dramatic story, but because it makes a stable case. A stable case is a kind of respect. It respects the court. It respects the accused person's rights. And it respects Helen by taking her disappearance seriously enough to do it right. Another decision point appears when it comes to interviewing the suspect again. If he denied knowledge in an earlier conversation, do you try a second time, now that charges are pending? Sometimes detectives do, sometimes they don't. Often, once counsel is involved, there is no further conversation. so the focus shifts to what can be proven without him. Still, detectives document the suspect's statements, if any were made voluntarily, not because every denial is meaningful, but because inconsistencies can matter. A claimed address that conflicts with a lease record, a claimed work schedule that conflicts with a time card, a claimed lack of a vehicle that conflicts with registration. Each one becomes a small brick in the structure. In the weeks leading up to an arrest, there is also a kind of internal patience. The team has waited decades, but they still must wait for proper process, for a judge to review, for paperwork to be signed, for a warrant to be issued, for the right officers to be assigned, often with plain clothes and unmarked vehicles, to reduce spectacle. And when the day comes, it is usually quieter than people imagine. A knock, a few words, a person taken into custody without grand display, a car ride, a booking process that is all procedure, forms, fingerprints, property receipts. The detectives are not celebrating. They are checking steps. They are ensuring safety. They are ensuring the arrest is clean, because a clean arrest protects the entire case. Soon after, the public learns. A headline appears. A photograph may be shown. A short press conference might be held, mostly to confirm and to correct misinformation before it spreads. The family's privacy is mentioned, and the department asks for respect. If you imagine watching that press conference late at night, it feels almost strange, because you know how many quiet hours sit behind those few sentences, how many file drawers, how many forms, how many slow afternoons in archives, how many times someone read the same statement and refuse to give up. And then the case enters a new stage, not investigation but prosecution, court dates, motions, arguments about evidence, expert testimony about DNA, about chain of custody, about the genealogy method. This stage can be long, and it can be exhausting for families. So victim advocates become important. They explain procedures, they provide schedules. They sit with family members who are hearing the suspect's name spoken aloud for the first time. They help the family move through a system that does not move quickly, even when the need feels urgent. Another consequence of time appears here. Some witnesses are no longer alive. Some detectives from the original era are gone. Some notes were typed by people who cannot now testify about what they meant. So the modern team must rely on documentation and on the exceptions that allow older records to be introduced properly. This is why those early case notes matter so much. If a 1973 detective wrote clearly, with dates and signatures, those pages can still stand as reliable records. If they wrote vaguely, those pages become harder to use. So, in a way, the case is a collaboration across time, between people who never met. In court preparation, the lab analysts become central voices. They explain calmly what was tested. They explain how contamination is prevented. They explain the strength of the match, in statistical terms that a jury can understand. They explain what investigative genealogy did and did not do. They make it clear that genealogy is a lead generator, not proof. And they make it clear that the proof came from confirmatory testing, done through proper forensic channels. That distinction matters, because it keeps the story honest. The defense will likely challenge the use of genealogy. They may argue about privacy, they may argue about methodology, they may argue that the family tree work is too indirect, and the prosecution responds with procedure, authorization, compliance, and the simple point that the final comparison was a direct match. The detectives, in turn, prepare to testify about chain of custody, where the evidence was stored, who accessed it, how it was sealed, when it was transferred to the lab. They may even bring in an evidence custodian, someone who can explain the property room's practices over the decades. This is also where the story of patience becomes visible, not as a sentimental theme, but as a legal reality. The reason the case can be brought now, after so long, is because someone preserved the evidence. Someone logged it. Someone did not discard it during an evidence purge. Someone treated it as belonging to a person, not just to a number. Now, while prosecution moves forward, the detectives often keep working quietly, because a case does not stop needing answers once an arrest is made. There may still be unknowns. There may still be related evidence to find. There may be an effort to locate Helen's remains, if that is part of the case, though outcomes vary and are not always possible. If searches are conducted, they are planned with care. Old addresses are revisited. Properties are examined if legal access is granted. Ground-penetrating radar might be considered in some contexts, though it depends on site and justification. But even these steps are done with restraint, because the goal is not to disturb the world, the goal is to find truth with the smallest necessary footprint. Sometimes these later searches do not produce what people hope. Time changes land, buildings are demolished, soil is moved, ownership changes, and legal access becomes complicated. Even when a location is identified as worth searching, the ground may no longer hold what it once did. And that is one of the quieter lessons of cold cases. Even when you solve the central question of who, the question of where and how may remain partly unanswered, not because investigators don't care, but because the world keeps moving. And the world is not designed to preserve evidence for half a century. Still, the family often wants to know what can be known. They want to understand the likely shape of Helen's last day. They want to know whether she suffered. They want to know whether she was afraid. Those are human questions, and they deserve gentleness. But the justice system can only answer some of them. So detectives and advocates learn to speak in careful terms. We know this, we can infer that. We cannot confirm this part. We do not want to tell you something that might later prove untrue. That kind of honesty is hard, but it is respectful. Another development can appear here, sometimes unexpectedly. Once a suspect is named publicly, older community members sometimes come forward. A person who kept quiet for years, a neighbor who moved away and did not want to get involved, a relative who heard something in the 1970s and dismissed it as talk. These new tips are handled carefully because they arrive in a charged atmosphere. Some will be sincere and useful. Some will be shaped by headlines. So detectives apply the same rule as always. Can it be corroborated? Can it be tied to records? Can it be confirmed by another source? If a new witness offers something concrete, like a specific address or a specific vehicle detail, the detectives test it. They check whether the suspect had access to that address. They check whether the vehicle detail matches any record. They check whether the witness can place the memory in a specific season, a specific holiday, a specific job. Those anchors matter. Sometimes these late tips help fill in small gaps. Not gaps that change the legal case, but gaps that matter to the family. A clearer sense of where Helen might have been approached. A confirmation that the suspect was seen near a particular corner. A memory of a conversation,